some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. As I was reading this passage, it's one of those that really should hit home to most of us Christians. We do have a tendency to have certain sins that are socially acceptable within the church, and certain sins which are not socially acceptable in the church. And yet the church is a place for sinners. So if you take an inventory of your life, as I often have to do, if you don't have a dominant kind of sin you can point to, chances are you are probably wrestling with hypocrisy or pride. Isn't it amazing how this sin can disguise itself as righteousness? How it can sneak past all of our defenses, and we put stock into it. We look at it as if this sin is all right, that this sin is justified, as if this sin demonstrates that we are in right relationship with God, when we could not be further from the truth. Isn't it amazing how this sin keeps us from other people? As one person has noted, the interesting thing about pride is that pride demands loneliness. All of the other sins, you tend to gather together with sinners of the same kind, but pride doesn't do that. We're always in a competition when we have pride. I know this because I wrestle with pride day in and day out. It is probably my dominant sin, and I'm very proud of that. It is the thing that I find sneaks out when I least expect it. I can remember one incident early in my seminary career. I can remember being in class and being very dismissive of people who got their jobs as history teachers in high school, but who were really coaches. Not 5 minutes into a soliloquy on the Second World War, though, I bungled the history. And wouldn't you know it, a second career seminarian who happened to have been a former wrestling coach and history professor was there to correct me. And also let me know his background. I was embarrassed. But more importantly, I was angry. How dare this person prove me wrong? When we give ourselves over to pride, we have only ourselves to blame when we come up short. We can call out the Pharisee in this parable, but we know the truth. The Pharisee is us. Whenever we think we can fool God into believing that we do not need His grace. There are three characters in this story, and each one of these characters has a different motivation, a different goal that they're pursuing. For the Pharisee, it is the self-justification. A world built on rules of his own choosing. And wouldn't you know it, he checks all the boxes. Then there's the tax collector. The tax collector requires a right relationship with God. And finally, there's God. God who requires a right faith. So just as the Pharisee requires self-justification, the tax collector requires right relationship, and God requires faith, we too find ourselves with a decision to make in our own lives. With that in mind, let's see how Jesus addresses this issue. Now, modern readers might assume that in this story, as I often assumed, that the two people are going up to pray. And they're going up to the temple to pray alone. But instead, the Bible had certain times of the day, certain times of the week that were set aside to go up and to pray within the congregation of believers. Indeed, we might think of them not going up to pray by themselves, but rather going up to a prayer service. This prayer service set aside. The motivations for both men would have been completely different there. Both men have had reasons to highlight their moral strengths and hide their moral failings now, as the temple would have been full of a potential audience of people. One of these men focuses on that audience of people, and he plays to that crowd. The other one is fixated on an audience of one, and he focuses solely on that one who can offer him redemption. With this in mind, I find the Pharisee to be the more interesting person. The Pharisee is a complicated individual, made up of all sorts of different inclinations and priorities. And sadly, that reflect my own. I know that I need grace. But what is it in the Pharisee's life that keeps him from pursuing grace? What is it in the Pharisee's life that removes him from right relationship with God? It's the fact of the matter that at the heart is an idolatry. Friends, I do not need to tell you that the world is filled with idols promising us salvation. Many of us think that an idol is something practiced by people in far-off lands that they bow down to. And yet, when we read through Luther's large catechism, what we find are that there are plenty of idols for us as well. There's money, and there's power, and there's fame. And if you think about it, each and every one of these idols promises to give us our heart's desire if only we would bow down to them. And self-righteousness is a kind of idol. This man may think he's making up the rules for his own justification at any time here, but in reality, we all know the truth. We'll never be righteous enough, but we'll always be worried that someone, somewhere, will find out that we aren't righteous as we appear. His prayers, therefore, are not directed at God. In fact, they're directed at everybody but God. His prayers are directed at an audience of people gathered around. When it says he stood far off, that doesn't mean that he's off on a silent place. That means he's trying to stand apart from the unwashed masses who are gathered around him at the prayer service. He is not in community with other people. The one thing that links all humanity together is this: we are all in desperate need of a Savior. And when we gather together in the church, we gather together expressly demonstrate that need. He stands far off. He thinks that he himself alone is the righteous one, and this rabble can't come close to his holiness. And so he prays a prayer. Who does he thank in this prayer? Certainly not God. If we had any doubt, Jesus would have removed that down by the end of the parable. No, he thanks himself. His thanks to God is perfunctory because he knows who really deserves the credit for his moral life: himself. This is what is meant by he prayed to himself. For he was not only the giver of the prayer of praise and thanksgiving, but also its grateful recipient. He even lays out cardinal sins of his self-centered religion, which, oddly enough, leave out the sins of pride and arrogance. Lest we ourselves get too proud and arrogant, how often do we think this too? At least I'm not like that person. At least I don't have those problems. At least I don't wrestle with that sin. And so this checklist of sins, of righteousness for him is not about being in right relationship with God. It's not about a redemption from God. No. It's about avoiding sin. That is not goodness. Avoiding sin is not righteousness. Avoiding sin comes from righteousness, but it is not the cause of righteousness. Finally, he looks across the temple and he fixes his gaze upon the tax collector, and with a flourish, he thanks God that he's not like him either. The tax collector, for his part, does three things that would never enter that Pharisee's mind. He stands far off. He is unwilling to even look at God's glory. And he beats his chest, which is an action that demonstrates that he knows where his sin is enthroned. It is here that this man asks for mercy. This word is not translated as well as it could be. Mercy is an arbitrary action, as in the scenes in a movie where a person may beg for mercy from a just monarch or a lawman who comes riding on a horse into town. But instead, it can also just as easily be the story of a just person begging for mercy from an unjust king, or someone begging for mercy from an outlaw. Mercy is far too difficult a word to capture what is going on in this man's heart. The word actually used here, hilastheti, means reconcile me. Reconcile me with you. I know I broke the relationship. I know that I have wandered off. All the Hebrew scripture is filled with this. The word for redemption means to turn around. I was walking in one direction. I was walking away from God, but now I have turned around and I'm walking back to Him. But this man knows that no matter how hard he walks towards God, no matter how far he goes or fast he runs, he will never be able to catch God, for he is far off. His eyes are averted, and sin lies enthroned in his heart. And so he cries out reconcile me. I cannot do it on my own. And this is why Jesus says that only one of these men came down justified with God. The first man lacked faith in God. He didn't believe God's grace mattered for his salvation. Think about that. Think how many churches are filled with people who believe that God's grace is irrelevant to the Christian faith. No, this Pharisee either believed God was not powerful enough, or worse still, that God's priorities were pointless. What good is a relationship with God, this man thought, if I can't be king in my own life? His faith was in himself, in his moral works. And in those things, he himself had declared himself justified. But the second man realized something very important. He doesn't make the rules. If there is a law in this universe, this man knew he must get himself right with it. And that law was bigger and more beautiful than he was. And that law must have a lawgiver. And that lawgiver must have put in his heart a desire to be right once again. He realized that no matter how good he was, it would never be enough. When both men came down from the temple, that is, down into the real world, only one of them was seen to have a right relationship with God. The person who had laid his entire life on the line before God. Now, recent polls, to no one's surprise, have found that a majority of Americans can see Christians as hypocrites. I know, it's hard to believe. But put another way, they see the church as filled with the Pharisees who stand off in the corner and talk about how wonderful they are, and boil the Christian faith down to just a set of keeping the right rules, instead of seeing people who come with their need for reconciliation, their need to be in right relationship with God and their neighbor. We see this every week here. None of us are perfect. And thank God none of us lead with that illusion that we are. If you've been coming here for a long time, you know this is the case. You know that the person sitting next to you is just another sinner in need of redemption. You know that we're all just trying to get into a better relationship with God and our neighbor and all of the promises that God has made for us. And that when we leave this place, when we come down from our prayer meeting, from our worship, we go out into the world, and hopefully the world sees just a glimpse of that. Maybe the world sees that they want that too. Thankfully, we all know one thing. Just as this second person knew, this tax collector knew, our salvation doesn't come from our moral rectitude, but from God's faithful listening to our faithful need. We are bound to have bad days where we spout off in a Christian history class of all the things we don't really know. We're bound to have days where we are witnessing to our pridefulness. But the Pharisee's life was one of continually resting in that pride. The Christian's life is one of continually resting in God's grace. And when the world sees this in our lives, the gospel is rightly